I always check the thrust plates. Now I'm going to remove the armature just to show the location of the thrust plates. They're at each end of a diesel motor, here and there. Made out of plastic or some sort of compressed board, unless you go back to the 1950 diesels, in which you might find that they're brass. Now what I found in this one was that these thrust plates had some fairly large dimples in them, which means the thrust of the armature was a little bit more than I thought it ought to be. You'll notice when I move this, the motor laterally, as it would travel along the track, you can see a slight amount of adjustment in the armature to adjust for the thrust. I think some movement needs to be there to ensure the best possible mesh of the gears, but I don't think it needs to be excessive. Certainly you would not want the end of the rod inside of the armature, or the shaft inside the armature, to touch this metal. I mean, that's a recipe for actually heating the metal of the motor assembly, the chassis, up, and creating too much movement in the armature and causing abundant friction and actually getting the gear dangerously close to this softer metal. So in this one, both had dimples. I took out this one being the one that's used in the forward position, so the train is going to travel in that direction. Took it out and simply flipped it around to the smooth side. Now there's other options such as replacing it, but these were not worn all the way through, so I simply flipped it around. I left this one with the dimple because if I flipped it around or I put a new one in, there's a possibility that the armature would fit extremely tight in this position, and I don't think that's good either. So I'm going to flip this. I did flip this one around to limit that movement, but yet to have the movement that's probably needed for the proper meshing of the gears. Now the other thing I think it does is it provides centering of the armature within the field. As you know, the field is going to cover the armature up like this. Now there's two ways to center, two centerings of the armature inside the field. One is the circular centering. In other words, is this in the circle, centered in the circle that's created by the field, which looks kind of like a horseshoe. It needs to be centered inside of this cavity right here, this opening, and of course not touching the field. The other centering that I've noticed, particularly in steam locomotives, is whether or not the armature is shifted too far forward or the rear, exposing the armature beyond the limits of the field. Now, I've actually seen improved performance in steam locomotives in which I use the thrust washers to adjust that and minimize it, and to keep the field centered longitudinally under the armature centered longitudinally under the field without exposing too much of either end. Now when you seat these, of course, make sure that the bearing is in its depression there and there. And you can see how smoothly this one now rotates. That was part of the cleaning and adjustment process. In agreement with the owner, I replaced the pull bores. They had some pliability. They were not cracked or dry, but they were coated, as expected, with lubricant and with carbon dust and buildup. So I thought it best, and I advised the owner that maybe we should go ahead and do that. I prefer these grooved pull bores because when it comes time to change these, the pull bore can be removed, the tire can be removed from the wheel, and then a new one wrapped back around and inserted into the groove without having to remove the wheel. The other thing I noticed in this particular train was some movement of a wheel on an axle. When I first began work on this particular set, I always place it on the railhead to see what kind of performance it's giving, what level of performance it has, if there are any inherent problems that I can see right away. This one actually ran, had a little bit of grinding noise, but I noticed it had a little bit of inconsistent performance. In other words, kind of some jerky movement. It seemed to do really well on straight and get in the curve or on a switch, and it seemed to jump a little bit, and I just knew that was not correct. I've seen that more on steam locomotives, when a driver comes off the axle. A lot less, but not the first time I've seen it on a diesel. What I discovered when I was cleaning the wheels is that this wheel was operating completely independent of the axle. It could rotate on the axle independently, and the axle could move in and out, or the wheel could move out and back in. Now that meant that I think that is a possibility that what kept the wheel on was in fact the truck and collector assembly, not good, or maybe it could touch the chassis, which it already was doing anyway, but again, that kind of friction is not necessary and probably is not going to enhance any performance. I noticed that when I attempted to pull this wheel off with a wheel puller, that it wasn't even needed. I just reached down with my hand. Once I got the truck and collector assembly off, I just reached down with my hand and pulled the wheel straight off. Now, I think what caused it, again, was an overabundance. What I think caused it was an overabundance of lubrication that had penetrated the axle area around the wheel, or within the wheel. I noticed on the other side, I wanted to go ahead and pull the other wheel to make sure that it was bonding correctly. Now, it was an insulated wheel, and what I noticed when I pulled that wheel off is the wheel came off and left the insulator on the axle. Now, that told me again that the oil had penetrated and it was not allowing the wheel to bond properly with the insulator. This is the non-insulated wheel. Well, what took care of that was just a thorough washing and get all the oil and other material out from inside of that, not only on the axle and the bushing, but also on the insulator and also on the wheel, and it reassembled as expected. This one had to be bonded with a little bit of crazy glue, and of course that is something that has to be done very, very carefully, and not to mention very quickly, because the crazy glue will set very quickly. But I think it's going to work here, and I've used it before. Now that these adjustments have been made, I expect to move forward with the rebuild or final assembly of this locomotive and its railhead test. By the way, of course, part of the rebuild was right here on the reverse unit. Nothing unusual there. The fingers did not have to be replaced, but it did need a thorough cleaning, as the drum had a considerable amount of carbon burn on it, or carbon dust. The one thing I had to do was to remove that single thread right here of copper wire with the speaker. I actually severed it right here with where it meets the resistor and the capacitor, because I didn't want to have to wiggle this around a lot and risk breaking that wire, severing it. So I just disengaged it right here at the solder point. Now, my experience has been, in order to resolder these, you need to clean the tip of that wire off very carefully with maybe a very tiny sanding sponge or an X-Acto knife, and scrape off some of the insulation that's on that wire, and then the resoldering process will be much easier. But again, handle that single wire carefully, because should it snap inside the speaker box, then you got another problem. Thanks again for watching Dave's American Flyer Trains. So long, everyone.